Have you ever remembered something, a small detail, perhaps, that has had a huge impact on your perception of an event? It could be something in your own personal life. It could be an event in history. Or, in my case, it could be an aspect of a true crime case that I have been fascinated with now for well over a decade. And that, of course, as you know from the title of this video, has to do with the murder of a young Korean girl, 18-year-old Hae Min Lee, who left her high school on January 13th, 1999, driving away in her 1998 Nissan Sentra, and was never seen alive again except by her killer. And if you followed this case, as I'm sure you have, or you wouldn't be watching this video, you know that Hae's ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, was arrested, convicted, and imprisoned for her murder, and he served well over 20 years for this crime. But on September 19th, 2022, he was released. His conviction was vacated, and he was allowed to go home. And if you're like me, you saw this come across your news feed at some point during the day, and you thought, what? This is totally out of the blue. And then most major news outlets showed clips of this now 41-year-old man coming out of the courthouse with the beaming faces of his mother and of Rabia Chaudhry, the woman who had done so much to bring this case to public attention, beaming, smiling behind him. He came out, he waved to the small crowd of people clapping and cheering, and he went home. We had a short clip of his being in his parents' home and opening up the refrigerator to get some leftovers, an action he had not been able to do for well over 20 years. Okay, so I was pleased, as were all of the people who for so many years have thought that this man was innocent of this heinous crime. But of course, there were people who were not happy with this because they believed and still believe in Adnan's guilt. Chief among them, the family members of the young woman who had been murdered, the Lee/Kim family. Hae's brother, Young Lee, and then her mother, Yoonhwa Kim, and also to some extent at least her uncle, Tae-soo Kim. They believed then, they believed in 1999, and they believe today that Adnan Syed is guilty. And so, of course, they were very much opposed to Adnan's release. And they were handed a weapon, or at least a tool, to use in trying to get this conviction reinstated, because they had not been given proper notice, as is required by Maryland state law, that the family members of a victim of a murder, if there is a hearing about vacating the conviction, those family members should be allowed to appear in person. They had all moved to California at some point after Hae's murder, and they could not get to Baltimore in time. They asked for 3 more days, and that was denied. And so therefore, they started pushing for a new hearing, which happened 2 weeks ago, and which resulted in an outcome that sort of satisfied no one, although the chief thing is that Adnan will not have to go back to prison. His conviction has been reinstated, but his sentence has been commuted. Okay, so I'm watching this unfold, especially just the day after this, when it became apparent that Hae's family was not going to let this go. In fact, that was my first thought. I had 3 streams of thought, if I may put it that way, as I watched the events unfold. Number 1, this is never going to end for the Lees. They are never going to be satisfied with this unless the real murderer could be definitively identified. Probably there would be no arrest and conviction, but if they could be satisfied that somebody else committed this crime, then they could let this go and quit thinking that a guilty man was walking around free in the person of Adnan Syed. All right, so stream number 2. Who was this other suspect? Well, of course, the other logical alternative suspect has always been Hae's then current boyfriend at the time of the murder, a young man named Don Clinedinst. I have to go meet Don at the mall, is what she said when she left school. Well, what about him? And there were a number of incriminating pieces of evidence against Don Clinedinst, but these were only explored many years after Adnan's conviction. And besides, and here was the real question in this second stream of thought, I had always vaguely thought that Don Clinedinst made the most sense as the actual murderer. But I had always been very puzzled about what his motive could possibly have been. And this was what added kind of a layer of murkiness to this whole case. Why would he have killed her? This doesn't add up in any way. The motive that was usually assigned to Don, when indeed people bothered to try to assign a motive at all, was kind of a watered-down version of what was supposed to be Adnan's motive. So in Adnan's case, at trial, he was labeled as sort of a religious extremist or fanatic, as a Muslim, that he had killed Hae because she had shamed him. It was an honor killing, a so-called honor killing, a concept that Rabia Chaudhry has labeled hot garbage, and rightly so. Certainly, there are fringe elements in many cultures and many religions. Honor killings have occurred in some situations, but certainly not in this one. Certainly not with an American-born teenager. The whole thing was ridiculous. And so then when it came to Don, well, then the motive was, well, he was afraid that Hae was going to break up with him, and he figured if he couldn't have her, then no one else could. So you can see why I'm saying it's kind of a watered-down version of Adnan's motive. He's forestalling the shame of losing her, but he's not any particular religion, as far as I know, so that has to be subtracted. And the real problem with this supposed motive was that he had never shown any sign at all of this kind of jealous possessiveness about Hae. In fact, if you look at their relationship, and I do in great detail in the book that I've written about this case, he shows no evidence of being all that interested at all. It's really very clear that the instigator, the initiator, indeed the aggressor in this relationship was Hae, not Don. And I say that not as a way of blaming the victim, of course, at all. No one deserves to be murdered by any means. Hae was unwise in her actions towards Don, but she did not realize what kind of person he was and what was lurking in, I believe, in his background that should have been a big flashing red light to anyone who wanted to get involved with him. Okay, but what was the motive? That was my second stream of thought. Don's the logical suspect, but what is the motive? And then that third stream of thought, the fragment of memory swam into my brain from my magpie brain, I might call it. I suddenly had this memory of the voice of Rabia Chaudhry saying 7 words. And those 7 words were, Hae wanted to go live with Don. Let me say them again. Hae wanted to go live with Don. And I thought, wow, where did I hear that? I knew I wasn't imagining it. I could remember it very clearly. And I spent untold hours trying to track that quotation down. I never did find it. I actually went back through the transcripts of all 4 episodes of the HBO documentary, and I combed through a number of episodes of Undisclosed. I have a feeling that this is in Rabia Chaudhry's book, Adnan's Story, which I have listened to at least twice and which she reads herself. But I found another quotation that was actually better in the sense that it gave me a little bit of context. So let me read you the quotation and then let me explain to you why this was such a bombshell to me and why it got me started on the path of examining this case. So this quotation is from episode 4 of the podcast Undisclosed, which, again, I'm sure you know, was a follow-up podcast to the blockbuster Serial, which started in October of 2014 and which never really came down very firmly on one side or the other about Adnan's guilt or innocence. So Rabia Chaudhry, along with 2 other brilliant lawyers, Susan Simpson and Colin Miller, started their own podcast. And in episode 4 of this, they were discussing the reactions of Hae's friends at school to her disappearance. So she had disappeared on Wednesday, January 13th, and then the whole area of Baltimore had been socked in for 2 days because of an enormous ice storm. But on the night of January 15th, which was Friday, there was a big birthday party in honor of Krista Myers, who is one of Hae's 3 best friends. You'll see pictures of Hae, Krista, Debbie Warren, and Aisha Pittman several times. Those 4 girls were just tight as everything. And so Krista had really been looking forward to her party. She had invited just about everybody in the magnet program, I think. There were far too many people to cram into her house, and so they had rented out the local fire station where her father was a volunteer firefighter. And Krista had extracted a firm promise from Hae that regardless of this brand new boyfriend, that she would come to the party. But of course, she didn't, because by then she was dead. But nobody knew this except for the killer. And so everybody's talking about this. And now I want to read you the section from the podcast, and then we'll go on from there. This is the actual transcript. So it has the ums and the uhs and everything. And as I say, Susan Simpson is speaking. That's kind of what they were thinking. Like at Krista's party. Maybe she ran off with him somewhere. Him is Don, of course. She'd mentioned to her French teacher that she and Don had plans to move in together. I don't know if that's what the students thought was going on, if maybe she'd gone ahead with those plans and just wasn't coming to school. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. That reference to Hae's French teacher, that of course is Hope Schaub, who is kind of a major minor actor in this tragedy. I wonder if Hope Schaub ever tried to contact the police about these putative plans of Hae and Don to move in together. Note the wording here. Hae had told her French teacher that she and Don were making plans. No, she and Don were not making plans. Hae was making plans. And it suddenly occurred to me, well, there's the motive. There's the motive for the confrontation that led to this crime that no one's ever followed up on. Now, let me be very careful here how I word this. The murder of Hae Min Lee was completely unpremeditated. We know this because of the method of killing. Hae was killed by being manually strangled. And with very few exceptions, that would have to do with somebody with some kind of obsession of the feel of putting his hands around someone's neck and choking the life out of that person, some kind of serial killer or something. We can dismiss that and just say manual strangulation always shows unpremeditated murder, because otherwise you would have a weapon. But if something is in the heat of the moment, it's in the heat of passion, and all you have are your bare hands, then that's what you use in this type of killing. And so I thought, okay, Hae was saying, just to her French teacher, apparently she didn't tell anybody else this, that she wanted to move in with this young man whom she had only met back in October. So what is that, 4 months ago, 4 months previously, and had only been dating since January 1st, less than 2 weeks before her death. She's already making plans to try to get him to let her move in with him. An escalation, I have a chapter in the book where I lay out the series of events, how this relationship progressed under Hae's prodding, I must say, and how she just kept pushing and pushing and pushing for more and more involvement. I don't think Hae ever quite realized, and boy, she's not alone in being kind of not very good at understanding her own emotions. She never understood that Don really was much more than just a cute guy at work whom she had a crush on. Don was her avenue of escape. I think she had thought when she turned 18 that her mother would quit being on her case all the time about her dating and going to parties and staying out late and all that kind of thing, but her mother had not let up. And she thought, I'll show her. I'll move out. I'll move in with Don. The only problem with that was that Don didn't want her to do this. It's clear if you read Hae's diary carefully, and believe me, I have multiple times, that Hae kept initiating further steps in their relationship. And if we had Hae's diary on her computer that mysteriously disappeared, we'd know even more clearly the steps that Hae took. We know that by the time Hae was killed, not only had she pushed for a date with Don, she had started going over to his house after work, her shifts at LensCrafters, usually around 10, and would stay there for several hours and then go home, I'm sure, and then meet the wrath of her mother. We know that, according to Don's own testimony at trial, that Hae and Don had become sexually intimate during those visits. Again, that's according to Don himself. And now we find out that she's pushing to move in. And I think at some point when Don realized what she wanted, I think that hours-long phone call on the night of January 12th that stretched into the early morning hours of January 13th, I think most of that call was Hae pushing to be able to move in. And Don just thought, I can't let her do that. This has gone far enough. In fact, this has gone way too far. And I've been willing to go along with this. I've been willing, to put it rather crassly, I've been willing to take what's being offered to me by this pretty, charming girl who's making herself available to me sexually, but I am not in the market for a live-in girlfriend. And I think by this time he knew she's not going to stop with just moving in. The next step will be, let's go shopping for engagement rings or something like that. And he just thought, okay, this is it. I've got to break up with her. Now that's the motive for the breakup, is Hae's new bright and shiny idea that she could just move in with Don and get out from under the thumb of her mother. The motive for the confrontation is that. But this is my central premise. The confrontation did not go as planned. And it devolved into a horrific scene of violence that ended with Hae's death. And once you understand that, and once you understand the timeline that Hae was rushing off to see Don before going to pick up her cousin at the daycare center, which was her regular after-school responsibility. Once you realize that, then things start falling into place. This is why she did not show up to pick up that cousin. This is why she did not show up for work that evening, because she was already dead. That's another aspect of the case, by the way, that I think has been somewhat misunderstood. Where was Hae actually going that day after school? She told us where she was going. She wasn't going to the daycare center to pick up her cousin. She was going to see Don first. In fact, I was very pleased when I went back and reread the conclusion chapter from Rabia Chaudhry's book, which you absolutely, if you have not read it or listened to it, you should. Adnan's story came out in 2019, I believe. Let me read what she says. After school, she, that is Hae, was in a hurry. Hae left Woodlawn High School to meet someone she knew in a private place to where they'd summoned her. He'd summoned her. A place close enough to Campfield Early Learning Center that she thought she had enough time to pick up her cousin after the meeting. She was killed there in a heated moment. And I believe Rabia has it exactly right. So as I thought about this whole motivation for Don to have this confrontation with Hae, I began thinking about how the timeline of events would actually happen. Something no one else has done. This has surprised me. Maybe there's something out there that I haven't seen, but as far as I can tell, no one has ever tried to actually build a coherent case against Don. And there are many reasons for that, which I go into in the book. But let me just reemphasize, in this book, I explain how the timeline works. I explain, for instance, how Don's mother would have been involved. I even have some theories about Alonzo Sellers, the man who supposedly found Hae's body by accident, so-called, in Leakin Park on February 9th, 1999. So I hope that I've intrigued you enough that you will get a copy of my book. It's available in multiple formats on several platforms, and full ordering information is listed below this video. Let me talk a little bit about what I want to accomplish with this book in the wider world. So I said at the beginning that the Lee family, Hae's family, will never be convinced that Adnan is rightfully walking around a free man unless the real murderer is unmasked definitively. So I really want these people to gain some clarity about this case. And I always want to emphasize when I talk about the Lees that, with perhaps a bit of an exception here at the end of things, they have always operated honorably and legally, and I think for the very highest of motives. They honestly believe that Adnan Syed is guilty of killing Hae Min Lee. They believe this. They're not just deluded. And when you think about the sources of information that they have had, it becomes a little more understandable. First, there was Hae's diary, which talks about Adnan a lot, mostly in glowing terms. 98% is glowing, but there are a few little, spats here and there. And then, of course, and I think this is something that isn't always looked at clearly, their other big piece of information came from the trial. We know that Yoon Hwa Kim, Hae's mother, came to trial every single day and broke down in sobs when Adnan was declared guilty. Well, guess what? The jury believed that Adnan was guilty. That's why he was convicted. So if you're going to badmouth the Lees, you're going to have to badmouth that jury also. They had no idea that the two key pieces of evidence that they convicted him on, and we know this because the jurors were polled, the cell phone data and Jay Wilde's perjured testimony, they had no idea that they were false. And they found those two pieces of evidence to be very, very persuasive. So I want the Lees to recognize that the truth was not told. They have not been following all of the people who've been trying to exonerate Adnan. Of course not. That angers them, that somebody would try to exonerate the murderer of their beloved family member. Of course. We do know from a Reddit post that Young Lee at least listened to some of Serial. But as I mentioned earlier, Serial did not come down definitively on either side. So that's what I want to accomplish here. I want the Lees to know the truth. As for Don Clinedinst himself, I have no particular vendetta here. I know quite a few things about his personal life that I kept out of the book. I'm not interested in doxing anybody. I know quite a bit about his mother and his, it seems to be now ex-stepmother, and their part in this whole cover-up after this bombshell of this murder burst upon their lives. I have no idea what could be accomplished. As for Alonzo Sellers, I think he was involved and could possibly clear some things up, could make some kind of deal. And I know that Jay Wiles could finally speak up and tell the truth about how he came to give the ridiculous testimony that he gave at trial. He has reversed himself a number of times. So now would be the time for him to reverse himself for good and just tell the truth. So again, I would encourage you to get the book and to see what you think. And I will mention here as a little postscript. You may have thought, 2.5 years after Adnan's release, she finally gets this book out. What's she been doing for 2.5 years? Well, doing a lot of procrastinating, doing a lot of self-doubting that I really had anything legitimate to say, writing various versions and rewriting them. And, sometimes when you procrastinate, things turn out better than they would have if you hadn't procrastinated. At least I like to think this way sometimes. So I mentioned the Undisclosed podcast, which I followed obsessively during I think it was about 9 months when they were on a regular schedule of episodes. They were actually doing 2 episodes a week there for a while. Colin and Susan and Rabia, who all had lives and families as well as full-time jobs. This podcast must have just taken over their sleep. I don't know. They had covered the case from stem to stern, and then they came back and they had some special episodes about the post-conviction relief hearings that were held in 2016 under the masterful hand of Thru Vignaraja. That man. And then it had pretty much petered out. And then, of course, there was Rabia's book, and there was the HBO documentary. But that podcast had just been something that I was obsessed with. And there have been other true crime podcasts that have come to an end, and I've taken them off my podcast feed. But I had never done that with Undisclosed. It was down way at the bottom of the list of podcasts on my app, and I couldn't bring myself to take it off. Maybe someday they'd come back. They did, of course, a number of seasons after Adnan's case. I think about a dozen, actually, and had some real success in overturning some unjust convictions. So as I was finishing up, kind of the preliminary finishing up on this book, lo and behold, Undisclosed popped up with a follow-up episode. Rabia and Colin Miller are going to start the podcast up again, probably next month. And they said, we have some information that never made it into the documentary, never made it into the original podcast, that we want to go back to the beginning and take a look at some of these things. And including Colin Miller's mysterious bombshell, which has been out there in the ether for all these years. But one of the things they mentioned was that, for instance, they have testimony from a woman who worked with Don's mother, Anita Baird. Well, I have a lot to say about Anita Baird in my book. A lot. So I thought, I wonder if they're kind of on the same page as I am. And they also mentioned the psychic. I have a bonus chapter about the psychic in my book. I also, by the way, have a bonus chapter about Asia McClain. Just a little teaser here. Asia has her date wrong. She did not talk to Adnan right after school in the library on January 13th. She did not. That has nothing to do with Adnan's guilt or innocence, but it does mean that she's simply wrong. She's not lying, she's just wrong. So anyway, one of the nice things that's happening here because of my procrastination is that I'm coming out with this book right at the same time that Rabia and Colin are publicizing their new episodes of the podcast. And so I am reaching out to them and offering them free access to my book. And I'm saying, hey, if anything that I have to say is of use to you, please use it. And to you, as listeners and watchers of this video, I say thank you for watching. Take a look at the book and let me know what you think.